Díomh and Fáilte Roimh chuig an studio How to Be Irish. And today's guest is Bobbo the Bard. Bobbo is from Tipperary and he creates content around Irish mythology, Neolithic sites, energy, healing, spirituality. We spoke a lot in this episode about the mysticism of fairies, why you shouldn't mess with them, some of the run-ins that he himself has had with fairies and the other world. I had goosebumps listening to him tell his stories. Honestly, I think I'm going to be a little bit scared going to sleep at night. He talks about the significance of these different sites around Ireland. We talk about Ireland as a focal point for this energy in the world and some different similarities that ancient Irish people would have had in their rituals with other ancient peoples around the world. It's a very interesting one. Please do forward it on to anyone that you think might be interested, or indeed, if you are feeling generous, especially at Christmas, perhaps you could go and check out the Patreon and become a member. As always, thank you so much for listening, and stay Slán. Bobby is a content creator known as Bobbo the Bard. He visits and connects to various ancient sacred sites around Ireland and channels music and poetry from these sites. He's a musician, a poet, and now an author of a recently published book called My Poetic Awakening. Congratulations, Bobbo. His content is based around spirituality, nature, and mental health. And he's also the host of the Creative Space podcast, which I'd really recommend you to check out after this episode. Some fantastic themes and topics in there, which I've been delving into recently. Thank you so much for coming to How to Be Irish studio today, Bobbo. How are you doing?
Great, Una. Thank you for having me. And I love what you're doing with this. All of a sudden, it's like a lot of people just realize we're Irish in a way.
Yeah.
We've always been Irish, obviously, but I've spoken to loads of people around our generation, and it's sort of like we're just really appreciating where we come from now all of a sudden. So it's great to be on your podcast, and I love the team of it. I love what you're doing.
Thank you. I agree with you. That's where the podcast came from. It's the idea of this kind of like second Gaelic revival, similar to the one in like the early 1900s, and where we were looking back to our old ways of doing things and kind of bringing that to the forefront. And I know that's something that you are doing in your everyday life. It's what a lot of your content is created around. I'd love to find out how you started to get interested in the Irish mythology, sacred sites, the Neolithic tombs, all those types of things.
So I'm from rural Ireland. I'm from the countryside in Tipperary. So I've always been visiting these sort of places, being out in nature, but just doing it to kind of, I suppose, get out and exercise and just for something to do, never really fully connecting or realizing what I was walking around or how old these places are. So it's kind of a common theme amongst people who leave Ireland. About a year ago now, myself and my girlfriend, we left Ireland to go travel in Southeast Asia for 6 months. We went to Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. But the funny thing was, even on the way over there, I just started listening to podcasts about Irish mythology. I started studying like ancient pagan ways. For some reason, I got this huge interest in Ireland as soon as I left Ireland. And it almost feels like I've been to many different countries outside of Ireland, but I never really figured until I left that the energy in these places are different. It almost feels like other countries aren't real and that Ireland has just something kind of unseen and unspoken about it, hard to describe unless you're in it, or even easier to describe when you leave it and come back. So yeah, it's like a common theme of people going to Australia for years. All of a sudden they're more interested in their Irish roots. It's like you leave the country and you look back at it from a different perspective. Now, Thailand especially is very open about spirituality. It's everywhere. Their temples are everywhere. Their artwork to do with their different deities are everywhere. So when I was there, I was like, it's such a pity that we're not really celebrating our own ancient mythology or ancient spirituality or the old gods before Christianity came along. It's because there's so much there. There's so much vivid stories and artwork that is done by people in Ireland, but it's not really kind of celebrated the same way that they do so in Thailand. So that's kind of when I got really interested in why isn't it the same. Now, when I was in abroad and I was looking back to where I came from, I started to get really interested in it. So then I was thinking, when I go back to Ireland, I'm going to start making proper content. So I was just starting to make a bit of content on TikTok and Instagram when I was in Asia. because again, it's sort of easier because you're not really surrounded by the same people. It's sort of like you're in a new place, you can kind of reinvent yourself a small bit. So I had a bit more confidence to start making videos. And then by the time I got back, I was kind of in a nice flow with them. I was getting inspiration for different things. So I came back in March this year. I had 800 followers on TikTok, and now today I have over 65,000 with just over 6 months. So it kind of took off, and ever since I started doing it, the land has sort of been speaking to me, calling me to different places, whether it be stone circles, dolmens. I'm more interested in the Neolithic era from 10,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. I believe in past lives. I feel like my most recent past life was from that time in many ways. Sometimes I feel like I'm Usheen after coming back out of Tirnanog, and all of a sudden there's all these cities and infrastructures and corporate businesses scattered all over Ireland, and I don't really recognize the place as much anymore. So leaving the place and looking at it from a different perspective is what really inspired me to come back and explore and delve deep into these almost untouched lands. And it's a mad thing because I've had people 40 years old, 50 years old telling me they've never known about any of this because they never learned it in school. We never learned it properly in school. I've always had interest in the stories of Cuchulainn and different things like that, but no one really told us about it. You kind of have to go and find these things yourself, which I think is so wrong. I think Irish mythology should be a primary school subject, or even a part of the history lesson. It was amazing to hear that people like a nice bit older than me are now reconnecting with these places because of the videos that I put up. And I've met these people and they're like, we never knew that these things were here. They're only up the road from us. And how, another question I get the whole time is, how do you find these places? How do you find, they're all on Google Maps. You just have to kind of go and look for them, you know? But yeah, you'll find one and then the story of that one is always connected to a different place, and the land kind of draws you in.
I was watching your series recently where you're trying to visit a different Neolithic or sacred site in every single county in Ireland. I think you have about 27 of the counties done now.
Yeah, I have 5 left. So that was an interesting thing how that all happened. I play an instrument called the handpan, and I incorporated with the poetry. And this summer I was doing it live up in the cliffs in Kilkee for the sunset, almost every sunset. And there's a guy there, Megalithic Ted is his name, and he just jokingly said, why don't you try to go to every county in Ireland to play the handpan? And even though he was kind of messing, I thought that's a fantastic idea, because the other thing about it is when I was in Thailand, I was getting buses 5 hours here, 6 hours there. I was traveling the length and breadth of that country, which is much larger than Ireland. So I thought when I came back, I need to actually explore my own country now, because I haven't. So even with this thing that I'm doing with all the counties, I've never been up north. I've never been to the likes of Cavan and Leitrim, and they have so much to offer, you know. So I wasn't really the plan at the start to go to a Neolithic site for every one of them. Even like early Christian sites was kind of in the mix, but I was just going to go to each county. But then once I started like looking into these places, I figured every county has somewhere like this, and this is what I'm interested in. So that's what I started doing. I have left is Westmeath, Cavan, Wexford, Kerry, and Clare. And funny enough, then it's in a moment of synchronicity that I started to getting getting gigs booked for the handpan and poetry combination. So this weekend I'm in Cavan on Sunday, so I'm going to be going to Westmeath and Cavan. So it's sort of like, again, these sort of performances are where I gather people in a circle and we play music and sing and do different things. It's sort of all aligning up together in a nice way. That's kind of another example of the land sort of pulling me along. I feel like I'm just kind of a puppet. I'm just kind of playing along whatever the plan has for me already.
And I know you've spoken about in your podcast before about the path of alignment. And do you think being pulled to these different sites and playing your handpan there, doing your sound healing for the land, do you think that's all part of the path of alignment in the sense that you're headed in the right direction?
Yeah, 100%. The path of alignment is a kind of a phrase I've made up, but what it is just following what you're excited in any given moment, and don't question it. Don't have any thoughts of where it might lead. Just go with it and see what happens. And I wouldn't have been getting booked for gigs. I wouldn't have met the person who edited my book if it wasn't for following this path. So some people call it the path of least resistance. Abraham Hicks, who I used to listen to a lot, calls it that. but I just kind of take out the word resistance and make it more conductive, which is the opposite, which is kind of alignment. So yeah, it's just following your passion, and portals of opportunity opens up because of this. It is like people talk about manifestation a lot, and that's something that I would have sort of practiced and looked into early days into my spiritual interests, but it's really, you leave out the action taking when people talk about manifestation. They set intentions and have a good vibrational state, but what closes that circuit is actually the action taking, and that's what I call the path of alignment. Just saying yes to opportunities and see where they lead. Or it could be just something as bizarre as, I want to go visit this well and put my hands in the water, and next thing you get sort of inspiration for a poem or something like that. Yeah, you don't question where it goes, because then you're kind of already doubting it. You just do it because you enjoy doing it, and that energy of the enjoyment will resonate with other people, and people have been kind of tuning in and following along the journey because they see that I'm enjoying myself and they enjoy the output of that.
Yeah, it's really infectious to watch that, like to see you have that interest and follow it. I loved watching your 32 county series because I noted down every single site that you have visited so far for myself, because I was like, God, I had heard of a few of them, but really vast majority of them I'd never heard of. And
Hmm.
I'd be similar to yourself. There's a lot of counties in Ireland that I've never been to either. And it just made me want to go there and go to these sites. Like, they have been there for so long and there's so much magic about them. The fact that there's stories told about these sites, and as you said, like, we're not learning these in school. It's such a lost opportunity, I think, in a way, but it's also really positive to hear that there is such an excitement now for people to connect back with those stories and with those sites. And you're bringing that alive through your content and through your work. I want to ask you a bit more about those sites in particular, Bobbo, if that's all right. So, oftentimes when you visit them, there's a hawthorn tree located there as well, and you talk about the different types of tombs and the different symbols that you see. Would you be able to give us a little bit of an overview of, if you're going to visit these sites, what are some things to look out for and what do these different symbols mean?
Yeah, so the hawthorn tree is, like you said, it's in our hedgerows anyway. They're a very common tree in Ireland, but you will always find one more often than not standing alone at these places. Sometimes they're actually a part of the stone circle themselves. So the hawthorn tree then is highly associated with the fairies. The fairies are descendants, if you want to call it, of the Tuatha Danann. The Tuatha Danann were a race of supernatural beings that first inhabited this island, and then the Milesians came over, which are the ancestors of the Celts, and then they put them to the other world, the parallel world that's very close to this. So the hawthorn tree acts as a portal between this world and that world. But whether you're into that side of things or not, you can't deny that also the hawthorn tree has very good healing properties for the heart. It regulates your high or low blood pressure. It keeps away heart diseases. So drinking the tea from the hawthorn tree, it's good for your heart. It's very medicinal. But also, if you want to go back to the spiritual side, the heart chakra is an energetic point, and the color is green. It's represented by the green color. And I think that Ireland is the heart chakra of the world. Now, some say that it's Glastonbury. I have not been to Glastonbury, so I can't tell you if it is or not. But even if it was, we still kind of occupy that same sort of space. So, because the hawthorn tree is so associated with the other world and the heart space, I feel like the heart space is a portal to that dimension as well, and you can open it up. So when you go to these ancient sites are often built on ley lines, which is electromagnetic frequency running underneath the ground, and then it comes to a point where it's concentrated the most, and that's where you'll find your stone circles and dolmens. It's sort of like their chakras and the ley lines are connecting all the chakras together. So to have the hawthorn tree at these places is a bit like, they're kind of like the mediators between this world and the next. They're sort of like the portal. Sometimes before entering into these places, I will connect to a tree, the hawthorn tree first, and I'll actually ask it for protection, because the energies in these places mightn't always have your best interest at heart either. Sometimes it's a bit like if you just started walking into a random house, that's their home, that's where they are. So when people just start kind of rushing in out of nowhere, sometimes you're disrupting the energy there. So I always ask for permission before I enter. I always connect to a tree and ask for protection. It's a very magical, Driocht is the word I'd use, these places. They're sort of like, I was speaking about the otherworld. I believe when you step into these places, you're stepping into that world because they're left untouched, because they're so ancient. You're going back 6,000 to 10,000 years old, a lot of them. The land and energy is untampered with there, so it's sort of like you are stepping back into that ancient time in a way. And some of the symbols then you asked about, so you'd often see, especially at Newgrange, you'll see the Triskel, which is like the three spirals, or you might see some Om writing on these things. The Triskel, I believe, is it's almost like sacred geometry and sort of how we do things in trees. Everything is done in trees. You have mind, body, soul. You have positive, neutral, negative. You have light and dark, and then the balance of the two is the third. So, and the shamrock, you can look at it like the shamrock as well, or the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. All these things are in trees. They're sort of different layers of densities, physical, the non-physical, and what's in between, which would be sort of like the hawthorn tree. I believe that the hawthorn trees exist in this world and the other world. So that's why you hear many, many stories of people might touch them, they might cut them down or burn them or take them off their land, and awful things happen to these people. And again, you can believe it or not, but the amount of stories are overwhelming. And these are like, pretty close to first-hand stories as well. We all know someone who knows someone, but especially the older generation, they'd be petrified to ever touch these things. But the Triskel then, the Triskelion or Triskel is the three spirals together I was speaking about. I used to be of the opinion that, the Druids and early Christian monks were probably eating liberty caps, which is Ireland's psychedelic magic mushrooms. They grow in the northern hemisphere, not just Ireland, but the northern hemisphere. I was thinking, they're probably eating these and seeing these spirals and amazing sacred geometry, and now they're carving them into stones, and that's what's going on. That's what I used to think. But since connecting to this land, I've had experiences where I've been completely sober and I started to see what would be unseen energy, but it started dancing around me and different patterns sort of emerging from kind of white lights coming up off the land, especially in Four Knocks in County Meath. I was in there with Adam Tahari, who's a didgeridoo player. I was playing the handpan, he was playing the didgeridoo. I didn't eat much that day. I had oranges and bananas that morning. So my body it wasn't quite fasted, but it was kind of cleansed of, say, processed foods or things that would lower your vibration and kind of not allow you to see maybe this kind of fifth dimensional energy. So we were in there for about an hour and we stopped playing, and I could just see the artwork of Four Knocks, which is like zigzags going up and down a bit like a snake. I could see that, only it was white light energy all around me, dancing around me. And had that happened to me a few years ago, I would have been very concerned about my mental health. I would have been checking myself into a mental hospital because it was so potent. Now, sometimes I can see this energy just from breathwork alone, but never as strong as this. So I even thought that I was kicking up dust, that it felt like there was dust in front of me, and there wasn't. Like I stood there for about nearly 10 minutes and it was still there. And then we played for another little while, and the door just swung wide open on its own. It's a heavy enough steel door, and it just completely swung wide open. So these places have energies attached to them. They have, sometimes these energies can manifest into something that you can physically see. What I was saying then about the Liberty Caps, I used to think that people maybe were eating them and then seeing these things. But then since that experience, I was thinking maybe people were just a lot healthier because there wasn't as much processed foods. I'm sure Druids and early Christian monks would have went through stages of fasting as well. And it's highly possible that people just had a cleaner channel for seeing these things back this many years ago, and maybe more of a connection to the land. I would say, well, definitely more of a connection to the land. They were the land, the disconnection is a modern thing. We've been put into houses, we've been put into offices, we've been put into schools, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we've left behind a big part of us, I feel.
So it's a theme that keeps coming up in this podcast, is that disconnection from the land and how modern life is facilitating that. And you were talking there about I never really heard about that before, but the idea of, like you said, oh, I just eaten oranges and bananas, so I hadn't had any processed foods, and I'd been fasting perhaps or slightly, and that allowed you to be able to see those energies. So
Yeah,
would you say then, like, if somebody wanted to go and visit some of these sites, and they first of all, they asked to be there, and they went there for a good reason, good motive, that if they were to like somehow cleanse or something, then that would be a way in order to try and connect with the land or the site a little bit more?
definitely, I think it would help. But also, it's not always necessary. I think if you're sort of maybe new to spirituality, new to meditation, new to sort of leaving your body, maybe just go and connect whatever way you want. You don't necessarily have to be fasted. I do feel that almost everyone will feel something at these places. It doesn't matter how much you've eaten that day. But if you're already kind of into this sort of thing and you want to take it to the next level, I would say fasting is definitely a good way to sort of open yourself up. My book is about actually some mushroom ceremonies, and in it, before the ceremonies, we would fast at night. So the next morning, you're an open channel to whatever you're receiving, because putting food into you is adding other energies into the mix. So if you want to connect to the purity of it, you don't want any other energy in there. You just want to have an open contact with whatever it is, whether it's a plant medicine or whether it is just literally connecting to the land like that. So I think fasting is quite a healthy process anyway. Um, it's good for cleansing of parasites. It's good for just realigning, recalibrating the body. There's a saying that fasted mind doesn't talk any shite or something along those lines. There's some sort of saying like that. But this would have been like a practice again, I think an ancient practice to go fasting and go without food for a certain length of time. Our ancestors would have went into caves. They would have went into like the caves of Kesh and Sligo, probably fasted, went into sensory deprivation almost, and it can be a journey in itself. It's sort of like how they used to use the pyramids for doing the same thing. And we had our caves, they had pyramids, or we had cairns, which are told to us to be kind of burial sites. They are burial sites, but I also think they might have been used for sensory deprivation meditations, where you kind of go in an empty stomach and you go into the darkness and you receive the light. Because when you surround yourself with darkness, there's only space for light to come in. And that goes back to the Imbus Forestny practices as well, which is an old Irish term for inspiration illuminated, something that I do practice myself. It's sort of the same as channeling poetry or channeling insights from higher realms. So the ancient bards of Ireland would have, as part of their training, been put in these cell-like conditions where it might have been uncomfortable, cold, and dark, but through that uncomfortableness, you kind of find you find a comfort in the discomfort, and you find sources of light through that darkness. Now, it's not to say that you have to perpetuate suffering and always be looking to suffer, but sometimes the contrast is needed, you know?
Yeah, it reminds me of like yoga. If you're in a perhaps very uncomfortable position, or if you're meditating and you constantly have to bring your mind back, like it's a lot of effort. It's not an easy thing to do.
Mhm.
I suppose that is similar. Cairns, there you said that they are burial chambers, but also you mentioned that they could be used for sensory deprivation. Can you describe what are these mounds, and people would like go inside them?
Yeah, they're circular mounds. They would have been used for burials of chieftains. So like Pat Noon has a cairn on his land. Fort Knox is sort of like a cairn as well. There's one up in Lough Crew. There's very little now that you can get into anymore. Most of them are closed off due to safety reasons because they could cave in very easily, I'd imagine. But the one in Fort Knox was kind of restructured and reshaped so that you could have people in there. They would have been used for burials of people of kind of significance or high importance. I think it might have really depended on the area, because there were 65 bodies found in the one that was excavated in Fort Knox, whereas I thought they were just kind of used for the chieftains of that place only. Recently, I've kind of been thinking that they were used for sensory deprivation as well, and it doesn't matter if there's dead relatives in there. If anything, it might be a way to connect to the spiritual realms, because you have where you've buried your ancestors there. So to go into sensory deprivation where your ancestors were buried, it sounds like a very daunting thing to do, but back then you have to realize that I think our view of death was a lot healthier, and it wasn't really something to be feared, but almost celebrated. Even in early, or even in Catholic Ireland, that's something that's still kind of a tradition today. You have the wake, and people would be up drinking and singing songs around the corpse. And the Celts, the early Celts of Ireland, would have celebrated death and mourned life. So when one of their relatives were gone, they were like, "Oh yes, they're free, they're released back to the universe or whatever." And then when a baby was born, they would have been crying for the baby. Oh no, they have to go through this horrible life that we have here. Of course, things were much harsher back those days as well, because you didn't have these cozy homes that you have now. The cairns, I think, they're also used as like an amphitheater, because the acoustics in these places are unbelievable. Well, the one in Four Knocks, so I'd imagine they're all very good acoustics. So they would have been used for probably singing, maybe keening, different types of music, and then sensory deprivation. I think because the veil is thin in these cairns, because you're literally, the other side is right there, especially if you've buried people there. It's probably an easier place to connect to the spiritual realms. That's what I believe anyway. Similar to sort of the caves in the Himalayas, people say it's much easier to meditate and reach higher realms in these places.
You mentioned there's something called keening. Can you describe what that is? I have never heard of that.
Keening was a practice done at funerals years ago. Maybe still today, some people still carry it on, where a group of women would cry, and they would sort of sing in a crying manner, and they'd actually get paid to come to funerals to do this, because it was such a way of releasing emotion and helping other people grieve at the funerals. And it's a little bit like a banshee's cry, but it's a beautiful thing. But I think, again, I'm always looking at the sort of energetic side of things and the more deep rooted things. I think that the keening, the sound of the keening, the sound vibration that came off that actually helps the soul of the person who died to release from the body, because sound vibration and music is a vessel for the soul to travel. So I think the keening it was for the relatives to grieve, but it was also for the release of the soul from the corpse. And again, I think music should be done more at burials nowadays, because it's of course, it's a time to be sad, but I think there's a celebration in the music as well. I was actually asked to play the handpan at my grandfather's burial this year. It's strange because the handpan is so upbeat and kind of happy, but it really did kind of suit the occasion, and I'd like to think that the sound vibration helped him move on.
I really like the idea of that. You mentioned about sound vibrations and healing aspect of them. And I know something that you do when you do visit all these sites around Ireland is you do sound healing for the land. How does that work? How can you explain a little bit about that?
Often when I come to these places, there's a sort of a heaviness, is the best way I can describe it. There's a heaviness to it. You sort of feel like you're walking a bit slower, things are just a bit down. You kind of have to realize then that there could have been awful tragedies that happened to these places, and the traumas of those tragedies are still sort of connected to the land energetically. It's not the easiest thing to describe just by talking. You sort of have to feel it when you go there. So when I play the music at these places, sometimes the sun comes out, or sometimes birds start singing out of nowhere, and it clears the heavy, dense energy, the negative energy away. Again, in ceremonies, this is something that shamans would often use, is different musical instruments to open sacred space and to sort of keep the energy in a way that you want it to be. I was there at the Piper's Stone Circle in Wicklow, just playing music, and three people came along who were kind of very highly conscious, and they said, "Thank you for transforming this place." Sometimes I feel it, sometimes I see it, but I often feel that the energy is sort of transmuted from a negative to a positive after I've finished playing, because the handpan has that sort of healing vibration to it. It hits the heart and the throat chakra. Like Tibetan sound bowls, they'll hit the crown and the pineal gland, and then you have more bassy music. Drums would hit the sacral and the root chakras, the lower ones, the kind of lower hums. So Yeah, it's land healing, but it's not just a sacred sites that I'm happy to do it for. Like some people might have, for example, cut a hawthorn tree on their land when they shouldn't have, and they could be having really, really bad luck ever since. It's sort of a way just to cleanse the energy, and if sometimes the energy needs to be redirected back into alignment where it's supposed to be, because when you cut these things, you're sort of, it's like you're snipping a wire, and now the energy is going this way and that way and that way, whether usually it's supposed to have a root and a path.
You're kind of molding it back into place, or kind of massaging
Yeah,
it, or making it feel a little bit more comfortable and settled where it is.
I can't fully always explain how it works, but I definitely know it works.
I know what you mean by that feeling when you walk into these spaces and there is like this, it's almost like you can feel like the people who were once there are watching you there or something. It's kind of hard to describe with words, but it is a feeling. I've never done sound healing for a space. I've experienced sound healing done to myself, but I know what that feeling is. It's like this lightness or something. Something's like been lifted up. You've mentioned also a lot about energy transformation, and you also referenced earlier about past lives, and you believe that you came from those times like 10,000 or 6,000 years ago, Neolithic Ireland, and because you feel really, really connected to it. I would
Hmm.
love to learn more about how you've discovered that connection, and if somebody themselves maybe has that feeling of feeling about their past life or something like that, how could somebody explore that?
Again, I would say explore it with caution, because it's not for the faint-hearted either. There's a breathing method you can use called past life regression, where you can kind of go into a meditative state and sort of visit your past lives. But what you'll find is more often than not how you died, and sometimes you can feel that pain again physically in the body. So it's quite a difficult thing. It's something that you kind of have to work at a lot if you are interested. So I said how I feel like my most recent past life was from that time. That's not to say that I didn't have a past life based 100 years ago. I think that time isn't linear. So in quantum physics, I'm living 6,000 years ago. I'm also living right now. I'm also living 100 years ago. So it gets a bit warpy for the mind to perceive. But my most recent one as my soul's incarnation, I think, was at that time, because I have a memory that I was an old man with kind of a long grey beard, long grey hair, and I was holding space in a ceremonial environment. And I looked up and someone came in and slit my throat. And I can kind of feel it in my throat when I go back to it. And it's a difficult enough memory. And the thing is, when you kind of experience that in meditation or past life regression work, the shock of that can kind of snap you back out of it. So it's harder to kind of get the full story sometimes. But what I feel into is that it was sort of a druid. I was a druid and sort of practicing or holding space in a ceremonial environment. And then probably, I would imagine, maybe Roman Catholics came in and murdered me, or maybe it was someone else, but that's just the feeling that I was getting from it. So I don't know how people would often kind of just start doing this work. The memory started to sort of come to me as a reoccurring dream, and then it's something that I can kind of delve into and look at it a lot more. I don't think everyone is supposed to um, be able to check out their past lives. I don't think it's for everyone to do, but sometimes if you want to kind of find out your higher purpose, it might be something to do, because often when in these reincarnations, we're sort of doing the same thing, just in different timelines.
You said earlier about Ireland being the heart chakra of the world. It's obviously from our perspective of where we're located, but Ireland is located in that position on a world map. So, and
Mhm.
it's almost the shape of it as well is not quite heart-like, but it's not far off either. And you said about the color green being the color that's associated with, and then of course Ireland and green, pretty synonymous. Like we can't argue with that. It's a really nice. I've never heard that before. That's a really nice way of looking at it. And yeah, I think that the past life thing, it can be quite scary. Like, and I can imagine a lot of people would be quite wary of it. Almost like people might be wary about going to like a fortune teller or an energy reader or something like that as well. Maybe it's not for everyone, and that's okay as well. Something that you mentioned earlier was about fairies and Irish people. I suppose if you know anything about Irish mythology, you'll probably know about fairies. and they're often like painted in a very positive light. But of course, the Irish fairies have not quite a positive light painted on them. They're not to be messed with. You mentioned that earlier. You talked about people who like maybe cut down like a hawthorn tree, or I know there was that story years ago about someone building a motorway through a fairy fort, and the whole motorway had to be redirected or something like that. Do you have any experiences yourself with the Irish fairies and perhaps their playful or mischievous ways?
I've always kind of heard the stories as well, and then you have the sort of um, Hollywood comparison with Tinkerbell and things like that, and kind of sounds a little bit dangerous to be kind of showing them as such, so people kind of get attracted and drawn into their areas. But yeah, I've had experiences with them, and it started again when I was in Thailand, believe it or not. My sister is in Canada, and she had a reading with a medium, and the medium told her that we are descendants of Tuatha Dé Danann, so technically the fairies are like our ancestors, and that goes for many people in Ireland. Um, but the things that that medium told my sister, I was like, wow, this is all kind of I'd never went to a medium reading before that. I just never really bothered. Not that it's a gimmick or anything, but it just doesn't really interest me. I can kind of tap into these things myself a bit. So just the amount of information that she gave her, and this woman was Canadian as well, so she didn't really have any understanding of who the Tuatha Dé Danann were, but they were still showing up for her. So that kind of made me realize, okay, maybe she's kind of legit. So I checked it out, and I went to her, and she told me that I have one following me around the whole time, and I have multiple sort of spirit guides following me around. And the fairies are the spirits of the land. So it's, they come in many different forms. They come in the forms of the banshee, which literally means the woman of the she, as she is Irish for fae. So, and then you have the puka, which is the shapeshifter, kind of transforms from a man to a horse, or maybe a deer or a hare. And then you have changelings. So look, there's loads of different types, variations of fairies, but for me, what they are as a whole is just sort of people of the spiritual realms, the spirits of the land. So then, coming back to Ireland with this information, I was like, okay, I want to have an experience here. For some reason, it doesn't frighten me. I never feel afraid in these places. I've camped in ring forts. I've camped in Aonmaka, which is an ancient kind of ceremonial burial site, but also it would have been the kings of Ulster would have sat there. And I've camped at these places, but and I was promoting this and I was showing everyone about these things, but I sort of pulled back a small bit, because just because I'm comfortable there, just because I'm protected there, just because I'm allowed to go there, it doesn't mean that everyone else is. So when I do share my experience still, I kind of need to be careful, because there's a neighbor of mine, and he's Italian, and he came here years ago, and he walked into a ring fort beside his house, and he didn't know what it was, and his dog was with him, but his dog wouldn't go inside into the ring fort. It was like, no way, I'm not going in there. And when he stepped inside, he said he just felt very unwelcome. The next day, 2 chickens and a cat belonging to him died. So he was explaining to me afterwards, and he was like, obviously it's because I didn't ask for permission and everything like that. And then he said, we have fairies in Italy as well, but they're friendly. So I think maybe because of all of the shit, oppression, destruction that this land has went through, the fairies, or the spirits of Ireland, had to put up their guard, and they had to work really hard to protect the ancient sites that we have. So the best way to do that is do something drastic whenever something happens to these places, so that people know to leave it alone. You'll have people that don't believe in these things, but will they cut down a hawthorn tree? Absolutely not, because of the stories. Will they camp into a ring fort? Definitely not. They mightn't even enter one during the day. My experiences with them is first started actually at the start of the 32 county Hampan tour. The first place I went to was Limerick, to the Grange Stone Circle in County Limerick, the biggest stone circle in Ireland. There's also a smaller stone circle outside of that one, and one of the stones has a hawthorn tree and an ash tree coming up through the stone, and the two trees are intertwined. It was also the first time that I drank hawthorn tea. So I drank the tea, and it's not a psychoactive drink, it's medicinal for the body. but I drank the tea. I did a breathing exercise on the smaller stone circle on my own. And the tea just made me feel really connected to the land, like really, really connected. After I finished drinking it, after doing the breathing exercise, I looked over to the hedgerow beside the stone circle and I could see two little faces just sort of peering out, looking at me. And again, it was subtle enough, so I didn't think a whole lot of it. I thought, okay, that's interesting. And the next day I went to Kilkenny. I went to Waterford, Gallstown, Dolman, and I went to the Rock of Cashel and Tipperary between this. But in Kilkenny, I went to Lake on Scoil, which is the tallest dolmen in Ireland. It's about 12 feet tall. It's huge. And I was there and I was talking to a guy. Again, on the path of alignment, you meet the right people. So there was this fella that was there. He does shamanic work. He does poetry events and things like that. I had never met him before. We were just chatting about these things, and he was saying like how the fairies will mirror what you are. So they'll kind of show up. If you're afraid, it'll give you a reason to be afraid. If you're respectful, they respect you, sort of a thing. They're almost animalistic in a way, because they kind of go on their instincts. They're very much in the present moment, so they can turn on you in a snap. But again, I'd say animalistic, but they're not really of the primal mind either. So they're like kind of somewhere between a human and an animal and an otherworldly being. That's the way I described them. So at that dolmen in Lake on Scoil, when he left, I kind of closed my eyes, and the first thing I could see was a woman of the She, and she was riding a horse. They were going for a hunt, but she was actually connected to the horse. They were kind of one and the same. I kept seeing this vision over and over. She kind of had a warrior look on her face. I was getting dreams that night and the night afterwards that I was being led back to their world. Well, maybe because I have interest, it's in my subconscious. Maybe it's why it keeps showing up. Still hadn't seen like what you'd call physical 3D hardcore evidence of one of them. So I explained earlier what happened in Four Knocks that time with the handpan and the didgeridoo and the door that swung open. What I didn't explain was what Adam seen when I was playing the handpan was there was a boy and he was really cold and he didn't want to be there at all. When he closed his eyes, by the way, he's seen this because I keep having to say it's meditation or real life. But yeah, when he closed his eyes, he could see a boy that was freezing cold and shaking and he didn't want to be there. But when I started playing the handpan, he got up and he started dancing around. And we reckoned that it was the boy that opened up the door and left after a while. And it goes back to the keening. He was kind of a spirit that was trapped there, and the sound vibration allowed his soul to move onwards and allowed him to actually release from that place. And that's the conclusion we both came to. So again, while it was very magical, mystical, and I knew that it was real because I know that these realms are there, it wasn't in this world. It still wasn't in this world, a physical encounter. But after that evening, I went to Lochcrew. Lochcrew is another megalithic place. There's cairns up there. There's a wedge tomb up there. There's a holy well at the bottom. At the start of the walk up the hill, there's a standing stone, and it was probably, I would say, 30 yards away from me when I was walking up past it. And sometimes you see kind of a red stain on these stones, and I was like, oh yeah, there's a red stain on it. And then the red stain looked at me like that. And I thought, okay, that's a bit strange. And I got a bit closer, and there was a man that was sitting against the stone playing a flute, and his face was really, really red. It wasn't the stone at all, but it was his face. And I couldn't see his legs. His legs were kind of in the ground. Now, I wasn't too sure, was this a supernatural thing, or was it actually just a man? But it was very bizarre how it came across. I didn't want to walk right up to it, because if it was just a normal man and he probably wanted some time alone or intimacy, it would have been weird for me to kind of just walk straight up to him, you know? So we kind of acknowledged each other. We sort of nodded at each other and made eye contact. And I went my way. I went up and I met someone up at the top. I played music for the sunset. On the way back down, he was gone. But this is where it kind of really gets real for me. I was talking to a woman the next day, a woman that I'm friends with, and I was telling her about my experience in Four Knocks with the energy. I hadn't even explained to her what happened in Lochcrew, but she told me that she was at Lochcrew about 7 years ago, and she was meditating at the standing stone at the bottom of it, and she opened her eyes, and there was a man there with a really, really red face. And he kind of just bowed down to her and said that it was an honor to be in her presence. And she thought that was very strange. Why would someone just kind of say that, you know? But she couldn't get over how red his face was. She said it didn't look normal. She said, I think it was a fairy man. And I was like, no way, because I hadn't explained my story to her yet. And then the goosebumps came, and they're kind of coming now. So I call them truth bumps, sort of, you know. That's what I believe was my first encounter. I don't think I was meant to go up and like physically kind of speak to him or anything like that. Sometimes you're just kind of better off acknowledging, kind of nod of the head, and that's enough. And then obviously there's the Irish mythology story of the Far Darrig, the red man, which is another fairy. So that kind of hit home then when I heard about that story a bit afterwards as well.
Could you explain a little bit about that story, because I'm not too familiar with it?
The Far Darrig was sort of like a leprechaun, basically, but he was more of a benevolent being that would play tricks and kind of come out. It's a story heavily associated with Samhain. And I wouldn't know the whole stories. There's probably different stories about him. He's like another version of them, like the Banshee and things like that. But definitely a trickster, and he's someone that will kind of agitate men, I believe, and kind of get them a bit angry and sort of rile them up a small bit.
My God, you were saying you have the truth bumps or the goosebumps there, and I was getting them as well. So I'm really curious to visit these places, but I'm also kind of scared as well after hearing some of your stories. And I know you talk about how the fact that you yourself don't feel that fear. Do you think that's because you're more connected to it, or you're maybe more used to visiting these places?
I think it's probably a mixture, but like at first maybe I could have looked at it and said it was ignorance, you know. It's just maybe I should be afraid. And then when I was talking to that man who at the Dolmen who said that they mirror what you are, so if you have fear in you, they might give you a reason for such. Kind of goes a bit deeper. Again, I was again on a Liberty Cap ceremony, and I know I keep kind of bringing up the mushrooms, but I want to make it very very clear that I do these things maybe once a year in a sacred environment. I treat them as sacred plant medicine, and because they're from the land, they certainly connect you to the land. But because I was in the height of the content making and talking about the fairies online, I just wanted to be really, really, really sure that it was okay. I had sort of permission that they wanted to be represented in such a way. So that was my intention of going into it. The most recent ceremony that I did, and I met them. I was in their realm. Again, do you know the one I was talking about on the horse? It was a woman. She kind of has nearly blue skin. She came to me and she tried to frighten me in the ceremony. She had these really scary look in her eyes, sort of like she was more animalistic again, and she kind of hissed at me and then blew this white dust into my face, and I was sort of more amazed and terrified. It was almost like they were testing me to see was I afraid. And I wasn't. I was just kind of in awe. And she had sort of like Native American feathers in her hair. Ancient pagan Irish ways and the ways of Native Americans are very similar, by the way. They have similar stories and things like that. So I think their fairies and ours are sort of one and the same. And then afterwards, she was behind a curtain, sort of laughing, sort of like it was just a joke. So I was told then in that ceremony that I was the Druid of the Fae, as in, and it sounds very egotistical, so I never really bring this up, but that's what I was told by ancient Druidic ancestors that came out of stone circles in that journey, and they told me that I'm the bridge between this world and the world of the Fae, sort of like I promote respect. I promote that they are existing. They do want us to talk about them because they're egregore in a sense that they manifest through the collective energy that we put into them, so that we can kind of paint them in a light, and that's the light that they'll be in. It's very interesting. You have Eddie Lenihan, who is a Shanachie. He would have went to gather all of these stories of older people than him, again his older generation up in the hills of Ireland out of nowhere, and he would have gathered all these stories, and they're mostly stories of bad things happening to people who mess with them. And Eddie himself would be like, I don't want anything to do with them. I'm happy to tell their stories, but I don't want to connect to them because of the way that they were painted in his stories. And then in the polar opposite, you have Pat Noon, who is the fairy farmer, and he is very much of promotion of connecting with them and getting to know them and talking to them and different things like that, because Pat kind of approaches it from that angle. He has nothing to worry about. But at the same time, they'll still play tricks on Pat every so often, whereas Eddie is approaching it from an angle where they're to be left alone it's okay to tell their stories, but don't tamper with them. You have to respect both points of view. So why don't I feel afraid? I'm still asking myself that question. I just think that maybe it's a part of my purpose, and I'm trying to always sort of check myself to make sure that it's not like a spiritual ego thing that, oh, this is my purpose to promote this and get. I always have to make sure that I'm not doing it for views, because every time I do those sort of videos, they get way more views than anything else that I do. So it's sort of always trying to humble and ground myself and make sure that this is actually in my highest good and the highest good of the land. But because I think I'm doing it in a respectful way and painting them in the way that they wanted to be painted, that's why I don't have fear, because I have nothing to worry about. I'm not disrespectful or anything. And again, all of these stories will always go back to protect biodiversity in Ireland. So the hawthorn trees, the hedgerows, extremely important for biodiversity, for all the insects and birds. Then you have stories of white butterflies that would have been, there would have been stories of they were the souls of children. Not sure was it unbaptized children or just children, but again, it's a way to protect the white butterfly, which are pollinators. So, and then you have the story of after the 31st of October, you shouldn't pick any berries after that date because they belong to the spirits of the land and you'll get bad luck if you do. But that could easily just be a story for the smaller birds going into the winter or smaller animals going into hibernation that needs the last of the berries more than the humans do. That's what the main thing is the moral of these stories are always protecting our ancient ways and our ancient landscape. And that's the main thing. Whether people think I'm crazy or not, that's fine. But as long as they don't go tampering with these things out of spite, that's the main thing.
I think people, even if they are a bit skeptical, they do have respect for it at the end of the day, because there's so many stories, as you said. I don't think people want to be on the wrong end of the fairies. I know I definitely wouldn't want to. You mentioned a lot about tombs, different types of tombs, like dolmens, wedge tombs, portal tombs. You talked about the tallest dolmen in Ireland, which is in Kilkenny, and it's 12 foot tall, which is just, like, to picture that is insane. What are the purpose of these different types of tombs, and what are the stories associated with them? And is there anything about, like, how they got those? Is the capstone is the one that goes on the top? Like, how did those people get those stones up there?
It's mind-boggling, a lot of it, because there's loads. First of all, I think they're multi-purpose. I was in Behmore Stone Circles in Tyrone, and it has 7 stone circles in the one place, and it was only discovered in the 1940s when they cut back the peat in the bog and they found there were stones underneath. But they were used for aligning to the stars. It was to see the star constellations and the alignments of the sun. So the most logical thing, they were used for calendars. They were used for farmers to see what time of the year they're in. When the sun hits a stone in the morning, you know if you're in spring or if you're in autumn. You know when to plant the seeds, and you know when to harvest the crops because of the alignment of the sun with the stone circles. So that's one function. I think that they're used for astrology and astronomy. You have to remember, like, this thousands of years ago, Ireland was covered in trees. So you look up thousands of years ago and you don't see any stars, you just see trees and branches. But when you walk through a forest and then you come along to the stone circle or a wedge tomb or a dolmen, usually there's a kind of a clearness around them. So there's sort of a space where there's no trees around them. And then you can look up and you can see the stars. So I think they're used for stargazing, checking out the star constellations and alignments with that. They were used for, like I said, burial places for people of significance. They were probably used for rituals and ceremonies. I found liberty caps in stone circles, around stone circles. They're always grown at these ancient sites, maybe because the land is left alone, but maybe because it's a ceremonial site. And then sensory deprivation as well. Like when the Gallstown Dolmen in Waterford, I was wrecked when I got there. I was just low energy and drained. But I went and I could hear the birds chirping. I could hear the sound of the breeze going through the trees and different things like that. But when I sat inside into the dolmen, there was just complete silence. And you can almost hear the blood rushing through your head when you're in there. So I think for meditation and sensory deprivation, again, that was definitely a reason for them. But how did they get them up there? That's something that I've been asking. Historians would often say that people put mounds of clay around and then they physically got loads of rollers and loads of men to roll them up. But even at that, it takes a lot of effort. And you'll often see that the Grange Stone Circle in Limerick, which is by Lough Ger. The stones from that stone circle come from a hill a good bit away. Like they found out that they're actually from a hill. I think it's like a 15-20 minute drive away. So why would they bring them all the way over there, go through all that effort to do so? Probably because they were more connected. They could figure out that this is where we need a structure because we want to harness the electromagnetic frequency. That's another theory of mine. But then, yeah, to get them up, okay, you could look at it like we had ways of engineering, we had clay mounds, we had timber rollers, we had loads of people that were willing to pull and push and physically get these up. I always liked a more magical explanation. So, because if they were all built around the time of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and if the Tuatha Dé Danann were actually a real supernatural race of people that were on this land, they had powers. They were able to lift things. They were able to move extremely heavy objects. If Fionn McCool could throw a 250 kg stone from one mountain to another, I'm sure building these things weren't too much hassle, if that's the route you want to believe in. Like the capstone in Carlow's dolmen is 150 ton. That's the heaviest one in Ireland. So even with fantastic feats of engineering, it wouldn't be an easy task, you know. Then there's also a theory that sound vibration, they used to be able to use sound vibration to make sort of a force field around these heavy objects to lift them. They kind of said that about the pyramids as well. I hope to find out one day how it all really did happen. I would be of the opinion that humans thousands and thousands of years ago were of a different genetic makeup than we are now. And you have stories of the Anunnaki people who came and crossbred with humans to share their DNA to take us out of a primal state to put us into more of a what we are now Homo sapien state. So there's countless stories of that. I had theories that the Anunnaki and the Tuatha Dé Danann were of the same race, or possibly the Anunnaki were the ancestors of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And again, I think these stories aren't told in schools because it's a way to suppress the power. Even if you don't believe in, okay, it does sound very far-fetched, all of what I just said, but even if you don't believe in that, there's really good archetypes in those stories, and you can harness the energy from those archetypes. You can harness the archetype of the warrior, of the druid, of the king or queen, or of, the musician, the jester, or the bard.
I actually wanted to ask you who your favorite character or story in Irish mythology is.
I always like the druids in the stories because they're like wizards. They're able to make magic potions and different things like that. I think my favorite story of them all is probably the Battle of Mytura, where Lugh defeated Balor of the Evil Eye. And I think my favorite character might be Balor of the Evil Eye, which mightn't usually be someone's favorite. He was the villain, he was of the Fomorians.
Mm-hmm.
He was a giant. He's a bit like, I always think of Thanos from the MCU series, the Marvel Universe. He was this big tyrant, but he didn't have a great start to life. He wasn't always evil. His dad got his druids to brew up this concoction, and in that potion, the fumes came and got him in the eye. So the reason why the concoction wasn't working was they needed the innocent mind to view what they were doing, and they got that through Balor as a child. And the fumes went into his eye, and then ever since he had this evil eye that would like spit fire at whoever was looking at it and different things like that. And the druids also proclaimed that it was one of his grandsons. One of them would end up killing him. He had triplet grandsons, and when he found out that he had grandsons, he threw them all into the water to try and drown them. But one of them survived, and that was Lugh. And Lugh was like the sun god, and that's where Lunasa, the harvest festival, comes from. Lugh got his spear in the Battle of Mytura, and it was like a freshly forged spear, so it was piping hot. And he threw it and got a true Balor's eye. So I think that was probably one of my favourite ones. What I also love about Irish mythology, and it kind of ties back into the Anunnaki theory that I had, is that so you had Balor, who was a Fomorian, which is like a race of malevolent giants. He was almost like a Cyclops character, but he had a child with someone of the Tuatha Dé Danann. So then that was Lugh. So you have Lugh, and he was half Fomorian, half Tuatha Dé Danann. So it must have been his sons, not his grandsons. And Lugh was half and half. And then Lugh is the father of Cuchulainn. And Cuchulainn is half human, half to a dead end. So you have a mix of different sort of species of entities in there.
You're almost like tracing your ancestry back through them. And people often talk about like ancient Irish history being Irish mythology and vice versa. Yeah, and it allows us to maybe connect with it a little bit more in the present moment in time. I could chat to you all day, Bobbo. We are running out of time though, and I want to ask you the question that I ask every single guest. What does it mean to be Irish?
It's a loaded question. It's a very loaded question. Many ways to answer it. I think to be Irish is to operate and create from the heart space, from the energetic heart space, rather than being up here the whole time, which is the way we've kind of been programmed to be, is to be in the logical mind thinking. But the heart isn't just an organ, it has a nervous system of its own. It's actually its own sort of mind. In Eastern society, they would have kind of made decisions or taken action based on the heart space, based on the emotion, based on how they feel about a certain thing. Whereas in Western society, we're using the logical mind the whole time. We take action based on how we think about a certain thing. But I think the heart can often be much wiser than the mind. And I think that's why there's this shift and sort of reawakening, and almost everyone is looking back towards Ireland all of a sudden. Whether you're from Ireland or not, there seems to be a huge interest in this island. And I think the shift in the world is a shift from the logical mind back to the heart space. And I think all good creativity, music, art, and just any form of creativity, all the best of it comes from the heart space. So what it is to be Irish is to have that heart open, and with that opening comes a connection to the land. That's my view of what it is to be Irish, or how to be Irish, is to operate from your passions.
I'm really trying to get to that myself at the moment. I think I'm on a little bit of a journey. I have a very, very long way to go. But I see in myself so much more of an openness to that than I did maybe a year ago or even 6 months ago. And it's kind of what you mentioned. You said you feel that people are maybe shifting away from using the mind to using the heart to be in the world, to embody creativity and to channel who they're meant to be and what their purpose is meant to be, and to connect to the land as well, as you said. So I think that's a lovely way of putting it. And especially if Ireland is such an important kind of the heart chakra, the central point of the earth, then certainly the people of its land should be channeling their true self, their true needs, desires, etc. Through the heart, of course. If somebody would like to get your book, My Poetic Awakening, how can they get it?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon, but also I have copies, so you can direct message me as well if you want. If you're in Ireland, I can send you it on post. I think it might be on bookworm.ie soon as well. I have the Creative Space podcast, which is an episode out every week. Check out my socials for different events and gigs that I have coming up as well. Bobbo the Bard. And it's nice to be on a podcast that I'm not hosting for a change. It's sort of it's more relaxing in a way. So thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're so welcome, Bobbo. It's absolutely fantastic to have you on, and I can't wait to keep watching you and keep listening to the Creative Space and get my hands on the Poetic Awakening as well. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you. Mila Buekas.
Okay. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I can't believe we're already at the 10th episode. It's absolutely flown. I only started this in September and we're nearly in December, so I'm hoping to go for another while. I would really love any support that you can give. Now, I have set up a Patreon. So a Patreon is basically a place where you can pay me a small amount of money in order to support my work with the podcast. You can do that if you like. It's completely up to you, but I would really very much appreciate it because it does help me with the running of the podcast. I'm opening this podcast up to sponsorships. If you do run a small Irish business and you would like to sponsor my podcast, just send me a message on any of the social medias. I'll get back to you. As always, thank you so much for listening.